Hello everyone and welcome to another video. The looping roller coaster might just be the most iconic coaster type in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, and for good reason. It's easy to build, has decent stats, looks nice, is not too expensive and, most importantly, it is available in a lot of scenarios. In this video we're going to take a look at all those aspects and more to see what makes the looping coaster unique. As the name suggests, it is designed around having access to the vertical loop element, which is the most basic inversion in the game. Other than that, it's quite generic, which is a recurring theme for the looping coaster. You get sloped banked turns and steep turns, which is nice, but you get nothing too fancy like a vertical drop or a unique track piece like the wooden coaster's water splash. This can make it a bit repetitive at times, but the lack of distractions also means it's a really good coaster type to practice with, and that's not the only reason. The looping coaster has fairly mild stats all around, which means you really have to try to make it too intense. Here is the pre-built jellyfish compared to the same design as a wooden coaster, twister coaster and inverted coaster. The twister coaster has even better stats than the looping coaster with lower intensity and higher excitement, but that's not fair as the twister coaster is overpowered as hell. The other two, however, have a significantly higher intensity rating than the looping coaster, with the wooden coaster even almost touching 9 while the looping coaster has less than 7. Sure, they also have a higher excitement rating, but when learning how to build good custom coasters, the main issue is usually an extreme intensity rating, and the looping coaster is really forgiving in that department. Here is a massive looping coaster with a 37 meter drop, 6 inversions and 7 positive Gs, and yet it still has less than 10 intensity. As a comparison, a wooden coaster with the same design has over 12 intensity. As long as you avoid excessive lateral G-forces by keeping the speed in turns below these maximums, you have to really go all out to get an extreme intensity rating. Fun fact, all the 7 different color schemes you just saw are default color schemes of the looping coaster. When you build rides in your park, the game will, if possible, pick a yet unused default color scheme, and here you can see they start repeating after 7. As far as I know, this is the most of any ride type in the game. For example, the wooden and the twister coaster have 5 and the giga coaster only has 4. If you know of one that does have more than the looping coaster 7, let me know in the comments. The cost is also a reason why the looping coaster is easy to use. It's not the cheapest coaster type, as the wooden coaster for example is cheaper, but it is very cheap for a big steel coaster type, as ones like the corkscrew and the twister coaster are significantly more expensive. This makes it easy to afford and less penalizing if you make a mistake and waste some money. Now that we have established that the looping coaster is very easy to use, let's take a closer look at how exactly it functions, starting with the one truly interesting element it gets access to, the vertical loop. To complete a loop you need a certain minimum speed, which depends on the train length. An 8-car long train can make it through with an approaching speed of only 59 km per hour, while a 2-car train needs a speed of 67 km per hour. Why is this? Here we have a 2-car and an 8-car long train both at the top of a loop. The center of mass of the 2-car train is somewhere inside the train, while that of the 8-car train is quite a bit lower. The lower you can keep the center of mass of the train, the less speed you need to make it through the loop. There of course isn't a maximum possible speed for loops, but it is not entirely unthinkable that people would sustain some minor injuries if you decided to take one of these at 200 km per hour. Usually I try to keep the approach speed at about 80 km per hour or slower, but as we've seen before, it's not necessarily a huge problem if you go a bit faster. A fun thing to do with these loops is to build another track through them. You need to be between 6 and 9 meters above the bottom of the loop, and there is space for 2 tracks next to each other. This means that with optimal placement you can cram up to 4 tracks through the same loop, and you can even interlock 2 vertical loops for an epic effect, especially if 2 trains take them on simultaneously. Apart from the vertical loop, there is another thing that makes the looping coaster interesting, and that is the availability of a lot of different operating modes. It comes with the standard continuous circuit and the block sectioned mode, but it also gets access to the launched mode and reverse incline mode. In reverse incline mode, the train gets pulled out of the station on a chain lift backwards and then gets released when it reaches the top. This is basically just a worse launched mode. Here we have 2 looping coasters with an identical layout, but the purple one is launched while the yellow one uses reverse incline mode. They have extremely similar stats except for the ride time. Whereas the reverse incline one takes 55 seconds to complete, the launched one only needs 35 seconds, which leads to a higher throughput. It isn't always bad to last for only 30 seconds. The only times reverse incline mode is useful is if you want to reach a speed higher than the maximum launched speed of 96 km per hour, or if you want to build a coaster that is longer than the universe. If you play RollerCoaster Tycoon Classic or Open RCT2, you will have access to a second way to launch trains in the form of boosters. They have a good top speed of 107 km per hour, but unfortunately they're also quite weak in the acceleration department. A twister coaster with the same top speed will easily overtake a looping coaster because of its much stronger boosters. They are still useful if you want to give your train a bit of extra speed halfway through if you need it though. Speaking of Open RCT2, recently the developers added a large flat to steep track piece to the looping coaster, which can be useful for avoiding high vertical G-forces and making your ride look more realistic. And that's not the only extra thing you get, as here you get not 1 but 2 different launched modes. You get the one from Vanilla, which passes through the station, and one where it doesn't pass through the station. This allows you to construct this design, which is an extremely efficient microcoaster, which is only outperformed by launched coasters that can do a corkscrew, such as the corkscrew coaster. It costs only 619 euros, and even if you spam a lot of them, you can charge 540 for the first year and 5 months. Not only that, every single one of these looping coasters also attracts 95 guests to the park, which is among the highest in the game of any ride type. But why does this work? Why isn't this design riddled with stat penalties? Well, let's take a look at what the stat requirements for the looping coaster actually are. Every design needs a drop of at least 10 meters, at least 2 drops, a top speed of at least 36 km per hour and at least 0.1 negative Gs. For every stat requirement that you miss, all your stats will get divided by 2. Looking at this, the micro loop misses both the requirement for drop height and the one for drop count, so it should get its stats divided by 4, yet that's not what happens. This is because if the looping coaster has at least one inversion, all stat requirements except the one for top speed are nullified. With a maximum speed of 61 km per hour and an inversion, this design manages to avoid any penalties. As I said earlier, you only have this launched mode without passing station in Open RCT2, so if you're using any other version this won't work and it will crash. You can easily solve that by putting a little spike behind the station, turning it into a slightly larger but still very efficient microcoaster. On both designs you can also put a photo section right behind the station. Even on the one without a tail, where the train doesn't pass through the photo section at all, guests will still buy the photos. If you make this design a bit larger and let the train complete the loop, you end up with something similar to the pre-built turbine, which is a more realistic take on the launched microcoaster and is still quite cheap and small. We're using steep turns instead of the more standard regular steep spike because it's slightly more space efficient and gives extra stats from the lateral G-forces. Remove the tail and set it to launch without passing station mode and you get the iconic shuttle loop design from RollerCoaster Tycoon 1. This was the original microcoaster, and I remember spamming it all over parks like Leafy Lake and Diamond Heights back in the early 2000s. A downside of this design is that the train has to slow down at the end of the track before reversing, which costs time. A complete circuit like this is faster and also has significantly higher stats, leading to a higher throughput with a higher ticket price. For all these designs I'm using the maximum train length in vanilla of 7 cars, but if you're using Open RCT2 you can add an 8th car for an even longer train. If you unbank the turns, add a little hill for negative Gs and make it do 7 laps, you have what I call a park value bomb. This is a cheap ride with a ridiculous intensity rating you can build in a park just to raise the park value by large amounts. Since no guest will ever ride it, we can put the entrance and exit buildings on the inside, making it even more compact. For those of you who want something that isn't an 8-second long launched coaster, I have this design. It's compact, has 2 loops, and because it's not launched, it can have 2 trains instead of just 1. It is still strictly worse than the launched coaster though. It's bigger, more expensive to build and to run, has lower stats and a lower maximum throughput, but it does look a bit nicer. If this design feels familiar, that's because it's the exact same as my medium wooden coaster design. Hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And we're going back to a launched design, which I built purely to be over 600 meters long and have over 6 excitement. This is useful when you're in a scenario where the harder guest generation option is enabled, as then only rides that fulfill those requirements contribute to the soft guest cap. It's not a bad design outside of that either, but it's also not the most efficient. For the final design I built a fairly large yet still compact coaster with 4 vertical loops and a station long enough for 3 trains. Even with the bonus of the track going through its own loop, it still doesn't manage to reach 7 excitements, which shows you how mediocre the looping coaster's excitement rating really is. Despite that, it is a very good moneymaker and it will earn back the 10k you spent on it quite quickly. And that is the looping coaster. It is a basic coaster type that is really good for practicing custom coaster building, while also being a good moneymaker for advanced play. You can find a download link for all the designs featured in this video in the description. If you want to learn about another iconic coaster type, click here to see my overview of the wooden coaster. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.